This is 560 WFIL.
Christian talk, music, news, and entertainment. This is the Mark Daniels Show.
And I'm grateful you're listening. This hour, some fresh new apologetics information for every believer. Later, Kenneth samples on the 7 great dangerous truths of Christianity. And up first, J. Warner Wallace. He's an internationally acclaimed cold case homicide detective whose investigative techniques are now textbook for crime fighters across the country. And they've landed the detective on Dateline NBC, Fox News, and many other outlets. Jim was, for the first 35 years of his life, an atheist. Today, he's a church planter with a master's in theology. And James Warner Wallace says you can believe because of the evidence and not in spite of it. His great new book is called Cold Case Christianity, and the website is coldcasechristianity.com. Detective Wallace, thanks for joining us here on the Mark Daniels Show.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, when I'm investigating a book, I have a couple of procedures I follow, too. At first I look at the endorsement page because, as you say, a lot of abductive reasoning about the book can occur when you know who already approves of the work.
Oh, that's funny.
I saw the names of people I know, like Bob Vernon and Mark Middleberg and Bill Boykin and Josh McDowell and Rick Warren. And then the guy who writes the foreword, Lee Strobel. I mean, how did you become acquainted with him?
Well, we were doing a conference, and he was the lead speaker, and I was one of the seminar speakers, and I got a chance to sit down with him and talk and share my story a little bit with him, and then we stayed in touch after that. So it really became a blessing to me, let me tell you, when Lee, I just really sent him the book to ask him if he would be an endorser, that he would read it and see if he liked it. And he wrote me back and said, well, do you want me to write a foreword for this? And I said, are you kidding me?
Wow.
Yeah, of course. So it was just really a great honor for me.
Well, for our listeners, just as Lee used his journalistic techniques to investigate the claims of Scripture in The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith, you used your highly developed skills as a detective to investigate the evidence and render a verdict on what the New Testament says about Christ and Christianity. How did that process begin? What spurred you to use those skills and knowledge to begin to look at the Bible?
Well, I was sitting in a church, a huge church. It was Rick's church, Rick Warren's church, back in 1996 maybe. And it was the first time really I ever stepped foot in any kind of Protestant church other than like a Catholic. I've been to Catholic masses as a kid. And I had never really been in a situation where I'd even seen live worship on a platform. I just was not familiar with that form of church. I'd been an atheist my entire life. And so when I sat there for the first time, Rick's got the ability to communicate that this guy, Jesus, is a pretty smart guy, and it might be worth your time to investigate what he has to say. And so I was only interested in Jesus as kind of a wise sage. I was not interested in becoming a Christian. I was not interested in, I thought there was more than enough reason to be an atheist. I was a very committed atheist. I was the kind of guy who would argue with Christians, more than happy to do that. So as I was sitting there, I thought, well, I'm willing to look at wisdom, though. I mean, the same way you might look at the wisdom of Socrates or of the Buddha or anybody else that you might reject as being divine, but they might have something wise to say. And that's how I became interested in reading through the Gospels. I just started, opening the Gospels up, looking just for the red letters, not concerned about anything else. But the problem, of course, is you've got to read through a lot of narrative in order to mine out what it is that Jesus has to say to you. And in that process, I recognized some properties that are common in eyewitness accounts of the same event when you've got more than one eyewitness account. So as I sat there reading through it, it piqued my interest. I thought, well, gosh, there are some attributes here that I recognize, something that I call unintentional eyewitness support that I saw between the writers. And I thought, boy, this is suspiciously similar to the kinds of things I see when you've got more than one witness of the same event.
Yeah, it's interesting. You had me up all night reading this book. It was awesome because
I'm so glad.
There's so many things in our Sunday school class that I lead right now that have come up, and boy, I wish I would have had this in my hand to deal with. The fact that the Gospels tend to reinforce one another if you know where to look and you investigate carefully. So it's not only a great apologetics book, but it's a primer on the essentials of logic, how to recognize and deal with your own bias and others, how to make and defend a case. It's an outstanding work on so many different levels, and I can see this being a primary textbook in Bible colleges and seminaries, not just because of the apologetics content, because you weave actual career experiences in and out of the merely factual information. So an apologetics book turns into a page-turner. I don't know how you did it.
Well, I'm really blessed you would say that, because as you're writing it, I'm just basically sharing the kind of outline of my own journey. I didn't have the template of like a Christian culture that I came out of, so I didn't really have kind of a tradition or a culture from which to draw. I just kind of was winging it. I wanted to look at the evidence the way I would typically look at any case, and so I just kind of chronicled my own story, my own journey through the evidence as I looked at it as a detective. And I wasn't sure what kind of value it would have for people. I figured there were some people out there who were probably like me, who were people who God would reach with this approach, that it's all God's evidence out there, and it turns out that this is the way he would reach me. And I figured there's probably other people like me.
Well, before we get into the specifics in the book again, to go back to the story, you're an outspoken atheist up to, the age of 35, and then you begin this investigation from all the perspectives and training and experiences you have over those many years of criminal investigation. What was that moment when the evidence began to turn your heart toward the veracity of Scripture?
Well, it was literally a collection of things, and I always say that I don't have like a spiritual birthday, where I can say, okay, on this date I prayed the sinner's prayer. It wasn't that kind of a journey for me. I wasn't even familiar with the church culture that the whole sinner's prayer thing seemed a little bit odd to me. For me, it was just about, at some point, do you get to a place of what I called evidential sufficiency? In other words, there was definitely a time at which I know I was a Christian, because I know by early 97, I was committed as a Christ follower, only because I can remember I still have a name tag, where I was serving in the church as a Christian. But where that actually occurred for me it's hard to pin down. I can tell you this, though. I became more and more confident of the gospel accounts, and I even bought and read through all the non-canonicals. That was important to me. What is the defense attorney? What's the other side of the story? What other possible witnesses are there out there? Are they really witnesses? Do they measure up the same way? I had to do all of that first, and after doing all that, one of the final things that kind of pushed me over the top was a forensic statement analysis I did of the Gospel of Mark. Not that in and of itself I think is all that compelling, but it was one of those last straws on the camel's back that really kind of motivated me. So I think that I couldn't tell you what one thing it was or what one day. I do remember having conversations with my wife, though, where I would say, hey, I'm pretty kind of shaken by this, because I think this is true, and that is so that journey may sound familiar to other skeptics who also take this kind of long route to the gospel.
Well, I got to tell you, as you read the book, you can feel your pulse starting to go faster and faster. It's just exciting to read it. Today, you have a master's in theology, you plant churches, you speak, you have blogs, and you run a website. Talk about pleaseconvinceme.com.
Well, I've been really fortunate. I started as a youth pastor once I got through seminary, and I started to post the messages that I would give my youth group on pleaseconvinceme.com. It's just because I was doing apologetics every single week. I was sharing the journey that I had traveled on with my youth group. And so we just walked through those every week. Those messages are still there. And then along the way, I met people from Stand to Reason, which is a great apologetics ministry out here in Southern California. Greg Kokel's got a weekly radio show. And I got familiar with that group, and they got familiar with me, and I just now have started with Stand to Reason in January 1st. So now all of our stuff from Please Convince Me has been put over on the Stand to Reason, str.org, and I'm really but what's great about Please Convince Me still is that is being blogged and operated by law enforcement folks. I met along my journey other people like me who were cops, a DA, people who are interested in evidence, and that site at pleaseconvinceme.com continues to be a place where law enforcement Christians are posting the evidence that they are sorting through to make the case.
Yeah, I've spent some time there. I really love it. PleaseConvinceMe.com. We'll put a link on the Mark Daniels Show page. Okay, we talked about how some of your real-life case experiences in the book, and as they say, the names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Yes, I did.
Or the not-so-innocent. That's in there, too. But let's talk about some of the information people will find as they read through this book. For example, what kind of case can we make for Christianity given that so many years have gone by and so many people believe we don't have eyewitness accounts?
Yeah, we have to make a case, I think, for the reliability of those accounts. And so what I try to do initially is give 10 skill sets, 10 principles that I think you can use then as you examine whether or not these gospel are actually reliable eyewitness accounts. Now, remember, some people will deny that these are even intended to be eyewitness accounts, but I think that's actually kind of foolish. Pardon me. If you think about how they're structured, the authors themselves claim to be John and Peter for sure will say that, hey, we aren't making up clever stories here. We actually saw this guy, touched this guy, listened to this guy. And so they're claiming to be eyewitness accounts, and they're certainly presenting us with a chronology. Now, some people will say, well, gosh, they also include events that they couldn't have seen. Matthew's going to include the birth narrative. He surely wasn't there for that. But this is very common in accounts that I get from the distant past and cold cases. That guy from 30 years ago is going to tell me what he actually saw himself. He'll tell me things that were told to him by other witnesses at the time, and he'll give me an idea of what the culture was like back in his day at the time of the crime. And these are the three elements that I think the gospel writers provide for us. So the question then becomes, how do we know that these aren't just lies? And that's what we do in the second half of the book. We apply some of those principles under a template that I've used in court that jurors use in the state of California to determine whether or not eyewitnesses are reliable. It's all about, were they present? Were they, corroborated in some way? Have they been accurate? Have they changed their story over the past? And finally, are they biased? And when we look at those four areas, we can examine whether or not the Gospels are reliable accounts, and that's what we try to do.
What kinds of questions can we ask about the New Testament Gospels to determine if they can indeed be trusted?
Well, I think the first thing you got to ask is, hey, how do you know these guys were even there? I mean, I've had witnesses who will tell us that they're someplace and saw something when in reality they weren't anywhere near the crime because they just love the attention they're getting, their 15 minutes of fame. This happens. It even happens with suspects who will claim to be a suspect in a case. I had one from 1974 that my dad investigated. Did this actually happen? So we've got to ask that first question. Are the Gospels written early enough so that they could have even been written by eyewitnesses? And there's a lot of skeptics who want to argue that these are written in the 2nd and 3rd, 4th century, and they cannot be trusted because they could not have been written by the eyewitnesses. So one of the first things we're going to have to do is figure out, are they written early enough to have been written by people who were actually present at the time?
What I loved is reading through the lists of information, of actual doctrinal points, that the students of the apostles and disciples were harmonious with those who wrote the original text.
Yeah, that was big for me because I was one of those guys who just figured this Jesus guy has got to be a legend. And as I'm reading through the Gospels for the very first time, I'm thinking, okay, the teaching part, that seems legit. But, come on, he's walking on, this has got to be a lot of embellishment here. This has got to be a legend that grew up over the ages where he becomes more and more divine with each generation that passes, where, maybe he didn't even claim to be God in the original, but now all of a sudden he's the guy who's claiming to be God, he's performing miracles, he's rising from the dead. This has got to be late stuff. And so it was important for me to examine what I call the chain of custody. It's the same thing we do in crime scenes. How do we know that a piece of evidence was at a crime scene 30 years ago? And we've got it in trial today, but how do we know it was actually there then? We take a look at the chain of custody. Was it photographed at the time? Was it passed along? Was another picture taken of it? Do we have pictures along the way to see what it looked like? Same thing we do with the Gospels. John writes a Gospel. He takes a picture. But how do we know that's an accurate picture? We go to his student, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias. We have the writings of Ignatius and Polycarp. We can take a Polaroid of who Jesus is based on what Ignatius and Polycarp learned from John. They've got a student, Irenaeus, take another snapshot. He's got a student, Hippolytus, take another snapshot. When we compare all the pictures of Jesus by looking at how they describe him, unfortunately for the skeptic, we're stuck with the version of Jesus we have today, the miracle-working Son of God who rose from the dead. And that was important for me to do because I really thought that would have been a late entry. And when in reality, it's the earliest description of Jesus.
All right, we need to step away. More cold case Christianity next, and then later, the 7 dangerous Christian truths that changed the world. This is the Mark Daniels Show on WFIL. J. Warner Wallace founded a website, blog, and podcast called PleaseConvinceMe.com. His book is titled Cold Case Christianity. We're talking about it here on the Mark Daniels Show. One of the things I love to watch is how a really experienced investigator can pore over testimony of a suspect and pick out certain words and be able to tell whether or not that person is telling the truth or whether or not they should be under further suspicion just from the words they choose. How about the gospel writers? What specific words they use, for example, in their accounts point to the veracity of Scripture? Yeah, and I do this all the time. I'm even guilty of doing this with people who send me email. I'm constantly reading through with friends, to read between the lines. What do they really mean by that, And I'm looking at the issues that are common for those who kind of work in this discipline called forensic statement analysis.
analysis, where we're looking at use of pronouns, use of tense, use of certain kinds of adjectives, use of compression of time or stretching of time. And so I did the same thing with the Gospel of Mark when I was first interested in testing it in some way, because I knew that Papias in the first century described this as being transmitted to Mark from the Apostle Peter. Mark's just recording Peter's teaching and being very careful about accuracy, but not so careful about the order of the actual events. And so I thought, let me take a look at that and see if I can test that. Let me see if Peter's fingerprints are in the Gospel of Mark in a way that would make Papias' claim accurate, because if it is, then we can say, you know what, there's a good reason to believe that this is another eyewitness account from the Apostle Peter that has been handed down to us in a way that's reliable. And so I just went through that entire process, looking at pronoun use, looking at tense, looking at comparing stories. Are there things about Mark's Gospel that are different from Matthew and John and Luke that would indicate that Peter has a special touch here? And sure enough, I listed in the book, I found a number of lines of evidence that I thought were compelling that gave me good reason to believe that Peter was actually involved in Mark's Gospel.
A lot of people who are attempting to make a case against what the Bible has to say and the veracity of Scripture and, of course, Christianity itself, put together a conspiracy idea. For example, the Passover plot, the idea that Jesus was taken from the cross while alive. He swooned and was revived later in the tomb, and then, that was one way that they pulled this off on all the rest of us. The other one is the idea that the Gospel writers just borrowed stuff from one another and they were working in cahoots. I mean, is this possible?
Well, I always say everything and anything is possible. So, yes, if you ask me, is that possible? Yes. But is it reasonable? No. And that's the big difference. We only care about what's reasonable in hearings, in trials. We don't care about what's possible. As a matter of fact, we tell jurors, don't even speculate on what's possible. That's out of bounds. You can only discuss and examine what's reasonable in light of the evidence. Now, it turns out that empty tomb, really, all the different theories that are offered about Jesus, is it an imposter, is it a hallucination, is it a swoon theory, all these theories somehow end up coming back to the empty tomb problem. And that means that someone either came out of that tomb on his own or somebody stole the body. So a lot of these theories come back to a conspiracy theory. Who stole the body? Somebody must have stole this body, so therefore we're stuck with this conspiracy. And I can tell you, if you've ever worked conspiracies as an investigator, they are very difficult to maintain. I'm not a big fan of conspiracies because I know how easy that you can crack them. I know how people are, for their own gain, will often give up the truth. And I've identified 5 characteristics of successful conspiracies in the book. And I can tell you that the notion that the apostles had a conspiracy held together, they lack all the 5 elements of successful conspiracies. In fact, they seem to possess characteristics. Their conspiracy would have to possess characteristics that are exactly the opposite of what I see in successful conspiracies. So I am not moved much, and I've kind of listed in the book why this is not a reasonable conclusion.
Okay, forgive my confusion about reasonable and possible. I have a teenage daughter, so I'm more focused on the possible than the reasonable most of the time.
Totally understand. But I was thinking, there's a lot of these skills we're talking about here that we use as a detective. I still use them all the time with my own kids. And my one daughter will tell you that she doesn't think she can get away with anything because I'm constantly using the same skill set to determine, now, what's your story about last night? Let me take a look at it. So I do think that these kind of cross-apply to other areas of your life,
Yeah. I know there are a lot of Bible teachers who are listening right now and getting excited about the possibilities of mastering these techniques and teaching them to others so that they become more firm in what they believe. And I guess the big question for those who aren't yet Bible scholars is that a lot of people have what's called an easy believism. They believe that things can happen, but they don't believe in what they believe. How do you make that leap?
It is tough, and I call it the difference between belief that and belief in. And I listed an illustration in the book of something I actually saw in my own life as an investigator. A guy who had at one point, believed that his vest would trust him, but he came to a point one night where he had to trust in his vest to save him. And I can tell you that that's really the difference. And the difference for me became when I first started off reading the Scriptures. I came to the opinion, at least first, that these seemed to be consistent with eyewitness accounts. I had a kind of a very initial step, that I could believe that these may be eyewitness accounts. But at some point, you've got to move beyond that. You've got to move beyond. You might even believe that these are reliable accounts, but that doesn't mean you're believing in them. That doesn't mean you're putting your trust in them. You've made that step from belief that to belief in. But I do think that the examination of evidence is part of this journey. And I can tell you that you're going to have a hard time now after seeing so much evidence and evaluating it so much. I am not the kind of person now, for the first time someone throws a challenge, even if that challenge has been maybe reworded in a way I've never heard before. I'm not going to flinch because I already have the confidence of years of taking the time to investigate the evidence. And this is like any case. If I've got 30 pieces of evidence that point to a suspect and the defense wants to throw up some one new piece, I'm not going to let that shake my case, and I don't think the jurors should let that shake the case. You've already got 30 good reasons to believe this. And of course the defense attorney is going to throw up something. He's being paid to do that. He's not going to sit there and say you win. So be ready for an attack. Be ready to have somebody challenge what you believe. But remember, like in any court case, that's just par for the course, and you've got enough evidence on your side to stand firm and put your trust in this, not just believe that it's true.
Yeah, you don't have to have every single piece of evidence, and certainly you can't prove every single thing that you find out to be true or false. I mean, it's making a reasonable case.
That's correct, and then you'll always have unanswered questions, and we tell jurors this all the time. Are you going to be able to make a decision, even though there will most certainly be unanswered questions, that there always are? I just had a case where a no body missing killed his wife in 1981. He got rid of the body and claimed she had run off. We didn't even have a body, had no crime scene. We had tons of unanswered questions. But within 4.5 hours, the jury was able to make a decision and find him guilty because they were able to overcome the unknowns. And you're going to have to do that. I don't care what worldview you hold. If you're an atheist, you've got lots of unknown answers. How does life originate from non-life? How does matter come from non-matter? There are lots of questions you simply can't answer. And all of us embrace a worldview for which there is less than complete information.
Indeed, you are from the Star Trek generation. You mentioned that in the book.
Yeah.
How does matter come from matter come from antimatter? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I shouldn't even say that, right? This is the old William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy cast. Okay, so you got to remember that antimatter was talked a lot back in the '60s.
Well, you can't run, a interstellar travel without antimatter.
That's as important as an important element. You got to find it somewhere. Yeah.
But that's not in the book, fortunately. It's a great book, and I encourage everybody to get it because it will revolutionize the way you look at your faith. Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels, and you'll see his name rendered as J. Warner Wallace on the cover. J. Warner Wallace. We'll put a link to it on the Mark Daniels Show page at WFIL.com. It's been a blast. Thank you so much for the book and for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Mark. I so appreciate you.
Christian content on the air and on demand. AM 560 and WFIL.com.
We're back with an hour filled with powerful apologetics material for every believer. Up next here on the Mark Daniels Show is Kenneth Richard Samples. He's a senior research scholar with the Christian think tank Reasons to Believe. Ken is also adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University and the author of several books, including his latest on Christianity's most dangerous ideas. Its title is 7 Truths That Change the World. Ken Samples, thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm glad to do it. It's my privilege.
You call them the Magnificent Seven, Christianity's 7 truths that change the world. We'll talk more about them specifically as our time progresses here, but what are those 7 truths as an overview?
Well, I think we would best begin with the resurrection. The resurrection is certainly the foundation of the Christian faith, but I also talk about Jesus being God in human flesh, or what we theologians call the incarnation. And I talk about the universe having a beginning and being fine-tuned. Fourth one would be the issue of so many of the things, the meaningful things in life point to God as the best explanation. Then I also talk about salvation by grace, that Christianity is a religion that does not teach that we're accepted by God by good works, but rather by grace through faith. And then the last two, I talk about being made in the image of God. And then finally, one of the real challenges is that God has a purpose for suffering and evil in the world. So those are the 7.
Indeed, we'll look at them one by one. But your title also indicates that these ideas are dangerous. How so?
Yeah, the word dangerous, kind of in philosophy and science, is an idea that turns the apple cart upside down. It kind of challenges kind of the standard beliefs of the time. And so What I argue in the book is that a lot of these beliefs, I mean, today the new atheists like to say that religion is not only false, but it's dangerous in a bad way. I kind of take their term and spin it in a different direction by saying it's dangerous, but it's dangerous in the sense that it's good and that it challenges various ways of thinking.
You say the resurrection of Jesus Christ is historic Christianity's most dangerous idea. What makes it the most dangerous?
Well, think about it. I mean, every human being who has ever lived on this planet has died or will die, but only one of them that has lived on this planet died a public death and came back to life. And so I talk about this idea that not all dead men stay dead. I mean, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, if he conquered death, I don't think that there's any more important thing that a person needs to think about, because, we're told by the secularists that everybody's going to die. You're going to die soon. You're going to die alone. You're going to be dead forever. If there is any evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, I think that's got to be the most shocking, the most revolutionary idea that anybody could ever hear.
Of course, that's the cornerstone of the Christian faith, but how is Jesus as a religious figure different from the other leaders and sages of religions across the world?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, and certainly right at the get-go is the resurrection. All of the other religious leaders, they died and they stayed dead. Jesus is the only one who has historical evidence that he actually conquered death. But I think it goes even deeper than that. Jesus is really an extraordinary individual, not only just in his teaching and all of those kind of things, giving us the Sermon on the Mount and all of these kinds of things, but in reality, Jesus claims to do the things that only God can do. I think that's if you reach into the Old Testament, only God can forgive sin. Jesus claims to be able to do that. Or only God can allow himself to be worshipped. Jesus actually allowed his apostles to worship him. He says he's going to raise the dead and he's going to judge humanity. None of these kinds of things are things that Muhammad or Krishna or the Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, claims to be. There is a real stark difference between Jesus and the other so-called sages of the world's religions.
Okay, we'll have more of the Magnificent Seven coming up. Ken Samples is my guest, and this is the Mark Daniels Show on WFIL. I have you linked to Ken Samples' new book, 7 Truths That Change the World, on the Reasons to Believe website. The link is found on the Mark Daniels Show page at WFIL.com. I guess before we can even get to a conversation with most people about the need for a Savior and the God-man himself, Jesus Christ, we have to start with origins. I think most people on the street would characterize the origins of all things as the greatest wall of separation between the Judeo-Christian worldview and that of the naturalist. How have, though, scientific discoveries of the past, say, 100 years in astronomy and cosmology and other sciences actually confirmed a biblical worldview of creation?
Yeah, this is really a rather radical thing. Early in the 20th century, there were lots of secularists who thought, what makes sense if you're an atheist? Well, maybe the universe has just always been here. And so very early in the 20th century, the belief was in kind of a steady state universe, meaning that the universe had kind of an equality of energy that kind of kept it as a static reality. But not too long into the 20th century, scientists began to discover evidence that the universe actually had a beginning. And of course, this went through a lot of analysis and testing. Today we know it by the term Big Bang. But the profound thing is that Big Bang cosmology, while not all Christians are necessarily, some Christians are a little bit uneasy about accepting the Big Bang, but I think it has profound religious and biblical repercussions. Essentially, the secular scientists discovered that the universe had a beginning, and therefore, they asked the very questions that Christians had been asking. If it had a beginning, then it must have had a cause. How did it come into being? Why is it there? And from there, they've also discovered that the universe appears to have many aspects of fine-tuning. That is, it appears that the universe has the qualities and characteristics in terms of physics to allow for the emergence of rational, cognitive, thinking people. I think this is the last thing that the secularists thought they would discover, but it's very much compatible with a biblical point of view.
Well, even beyond the creation from nothing, ex nihilo, the sustaining work of God in maintaining the universe and the delicate balance necessary for life, as if that weren't enough, what are some other ways that we can see God at work in His creation?
Yeah, I think not only just the fact that the universe had a beginning. I mean, the book of Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That expression, heavens and earth, is really conveys the idea of the totality of all things. And so a number of modern scientists have said that Big Bang cosmology is amazingly similar to the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, that God created the universe out of nothing. There was no pre-existent matter, but matter and energy, space and time had a singular beginning. But if we build upon that, I mean, the life that we live, human beings needing meaning and purpose and significance, how do we explain our idea of objective moral values? How do we ground and justify what's right and wrong? You know, on what basis can we say that what Hitler did to the Jews was wrong? It seems to me you need some kind of objective morality. You know, to add to that, how about things we can't see? Why do the laws of logic operate the way they do? Why does mathematics work? Why are humans able to discover, at least part, the intelligibility of the universe? And then I think to bring it back to our Christian roots again, what is the best explanation of the person of Jesus Christ, his miracles, his profound life? So I think all of these meaningful areas point as their best explanation to the God of the Judeo-Christian scriptures.
As we continue to work our way through the seven truths, salvation is a concept that's not unique to Christianity. Other world religions kind of pack a different meaning into the word and what it means to be saved. Speak to how the New Testament gospel of grace stands apart from those other perspectives on salvation.
Yeah, you know, if you let's take the second most influential religion in the world. I mean, if you look at Islam, which today they say there may be more than 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. I mean, Islam is very clear that paradise is an earned reward. It is something that God puts all your works on a scale at the end of your life, at the end of time, and if you've earned paradise, you get it. As well, if you deserve the wrath of Allah, hell, then you've deserved that. Salvation, there is no ultimate salvation in Islam. It is what you ultimately achieve, and so much of the world's religions are like that. I mean, karma. In Hinduism, you did something wrong in your past life, and so you did it. You pay for it, and this is also an idea that I think kind of permeates the man on the streets views of religion. That, you know, God's going to put your life on a scale, and if 51% of your works is good, then you're going to earn it. But Christianity, the New Testament says something very different. That salvation is a gift. That Jesus died on the cross to cover our sins, that salvation comes by grace, it's through faith. You can't add works to it. And you know what makes that such a controversial view? I think salvation by grace alone is such a controversial view that even branches of Christendom have had a hard time with it. And so we always want to kind of add our works alongside what God has done. But the New Testament teaches something very different.
Amen. Well, historic Christianity takes a very high view of what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, people who are in our area have a very much familiarity with the name Peter Singer. How does his views differ as a secular ethicist as to what we find created in the image of God to mean to a Christian?
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that that today people like the philosopher Peter Singer, he would argue for animal rights, and he would argue that some farm animals, chickens and pigs, that they have a greater conscious awareness of their environment at an earlier age than humans do. And so he would argue that they have rights that, babies, infants, don't ultimately have. And he takes a very different point of view, a very secular point of view, that any being that has a conscious awareness, they should be given the ultimate rights. I mean, the way the Western world has largely operated is that human beings have value and they have dignity because they're made in the image of God. I mean, we need to be thoughtful and reflective about how we treat our neighbor, because the way we treat our neighbor is the way we're treating God, because people are made in the image of God. And so this idea of universal rights, this idea that there's value and dignity no matter what your race or your gender or your class. I mean, these things permeate our political system today. All of that idea of universal dignity and value is rooted in the biblical teaching that people are made in the image of God. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people have lost sight of that, and people like Singer would like to replace it with a very secular ethic. So abortion of human beings would be okay, but you need to treat farm animals with a greater respect. Wow, that is such a radical departure from what our country deeply believed from its origins.
All right, just one more stop down here, and then Ken Samples answers one of the toughest questions a Christian will ever face. That's next, as the Mark Daniels Show continues. They're Christianity's most dangerous ideas if you're an unbeliever. They're the 7 truths that change the world. The author of that book, Kenneth Richard Samples, my guest here on the Mark Daniels Show. Many, if not most, Christians are stumped when they're confronted with evil and suffering in the world. We may have had a good Bible study on Job, but what do we say to a parent from Sandy Hook Elementary? I mean, how does God's Word, and in turn, how should we respond to questions of evil and suffering?
Yeah, this is a very challenging thing, and certainly when I think about those first graders being killed in that classroom, I can't. All I would want to do is convey to them my deep sympathy and concern. But I think if we step back and think a little bit about evil, and we think things like that are evil, that there have been a lot of evil things done. Something can only be evil if there's a standard of goodness. I mean, what Hitler did to the Jews was wrong only because there is a moral standard. Only because, again, we say human beings have value. And so it's true that sometimes religious people have to ask, well, how do we explain evil? I think the atheist has to ask, well, how do you explain goodness? Where does goodness come in? And I think another element in all of this is that Christianity teaches that God brings constantly good things out of difficult experiences. I mean, I like vacations, and I like entertainment, and I like all of these things. But you know what? I've never learned anything profound from it. It's going through difficulty that I learn character values of persistence and determination. I learn to have a greater appreciation for other people and have empathy upon them. So I think the fundamental teaching of the New Testament is that God brings good out of evil. And out of the most evil thing, I would argue that God coming in the person of Jesus to the world, he's publicly crucified by the people he wanted to save. Out of what seems to be this cosmic miscarriage of justice comes salvation for all who believe. And so maybe the evil in the world is the way that God uses to reach people and to transform their character. And there can't be any evil unless there's a moral standard of goodness, and I think the best way of explaining that is God.
We've led beautifully into my final question. It's this. Your title assures that these 7 truths have changed the world. We know that's for sure. But I guess the lingering question for the atheist might be, well, how have these truths changed the world for good?
That's a fair question. And I would say this. I would say, secularists are very enamored with science. They think religion is superstition, but science gives them real knowledge. What I would argue is that actually science came out of medieval Christianity. Science began in Christian Europe in the 1600s. And the reason it began is that Christianity had all of the necessary beliefs to see science as a valuable thing. God created the world. He made us in His image, so we can track His creative processes. Logic and mathematics operate. The universe has order and purpose and significance. I mean, it's true that the Chinese and the Indians and the Greco-Romans made contributions to science and to a kind of scientific way of thinking. But the reality is that science came out of the medieval Christian universities. So science really has deep Christian roots. Moreover, many and most of the people who abolished slavery came from a background where they appreciated the idea that people are made in the image of God. The very idea of hospice, that people need health care and we should take care of the sick. These are very much biblical ideas, and so universal education, health care, science, the university systems, these are all birthed within the Christian worldview, and I think non-believers have benefited significantly from that.
Well, this is a remarkable book, and that's why I contacted Reasons to Believe as soon as I got a hold of it. You explore logic and reason and introduce frames of reference. Each chapter has discussion questions, so I can see a small group or a Sunday school group sitting down and really poring over this and developing a very strong apologetic, especially when you speak to someone who comes out of a naturalist worldview. 7 Truths That Changed the World, Discovering Christianity's Most Dangerous Ideas. Ken Samples, a great book and a great job, too. Thanks for joining me on the program.
It's really my privilege. Thank you very much.